This ground that I'm walking on right now, it used to be covered by water. And as lake levels are expected to continue to drop here at Lake Mead, the gap between where the water was and where it is.
Stand at the edge of the canyon at Lake Mead today, and the first thing you notice isn't the water. It's the absence of it. A pale band of mineral-stained rock rises up the cliff face, a scar left behind by decades of retreating shoreline, and above that scar sits a desert that used to be a lake bottom. As of this summer, Lake Mead sits at roughly 1,043 feet above sea level, holding barely over a quarter of what it can when full. That's nearly 190 feet below the high water mark it reached back in 1983. Walk down toward the shore in places like Hemingway Harbor, and you're walking on ground that was within living memory, under more than 100 feet of water. Boat hulls from the 1980s sit cracked open in the sun. Old marina infrastructure that was built assuming it would always be submerged now bakes in 110-degree heat. And every few months, something new turns up in the drying mud, forcing park rangers and, on occasion, homicide detectives to drive out and take a look. This is the story of how America's largest reservoir got here, why the drop isn't a temporary dry spell that will fix itself with a good winter, and why the number 895 has become the most important figure in the entire American Southwest. Lake Mead exists because of Hoover Dam, completed in 1936 at a moment when the country badly needed both jobs and a symbol that it could still build big things. At full capacity, the reservoir stretches back more than 100 miles behind the dam and can hold in the neighborhood of 28 million acre-feet of water. Enough, if you want a comparison that makes it feel real, to flood an area the size of Pennsylvania under roughly a foot of water. It's not just a lake. It's the mechanism that let Las Vegas grow from a dusty rail stop into a metro area of nearly 3 million people. It's the reason Phoenix could sprawl into one of the largest cities in the country in the middle of the Sonoran Desert. It's the reason a strip of farmland in southeastern California, baked by triple-digit heat for months at a time, produces a huge share of the lettuce, broccoli, and melons Americans eat in the dead of winter. None of that growth was an accident of nature. It was engineered, and the engineering rested on a single legal document that is now more than a century old. In November 1922, representatives from 7 states gathered at Bishop's Lodge outside Santa Fe, New Mexico, to hammer out what became the Colorado River Compact. The backdrop wasn't polite bureaucracy, it was the real threat of a fight between states over water. California had been pulling enormous volumes out of the river to irrigate the Imperial Valley, and officials in Arizona were furious enough that there was serious talk of calling out the state militia to stop it. Washington stepped in, and Herbert Hoover, then serving as Secretary of Commerce, chaired the negotiations that produced a framework splitting the river's flow between an upper basin, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico, and a lower basin, California, Arizona, and Nevada, with each side allocated 7.5 million acre-feet a year, plus additional water later set aside for Mexico. The number that framework was built on came from a relatively short stretch of stream flow measurements taken in the early 20th century, and it put the river's average annual flow at somewhere around 17 to 18 million acre-feet. That figure became gospel. Every allocation, every future contract, every dam designed downstream traced back to it. The problem is one that wasn't fully appreciated at the time, and has become impossible to ignore since those measurement years turned out to be unusually wet. Scientists who study tree rings, cross-sections of centuries-old trees, whose growth patterns record wet years and dry years with remarkable precision, have since reconstructed Colorado River flow going back well over 1,000 years. That reconstruction shows the specific stretch used to negotiate the compact sits among the wettest periods on record for the entire basin. The longer-term average is meaningfully lower, with many hydrologists now putting the river's realistic long-run yield closer to 13 to 14 million acre-feet a year rather than the 17-plus million the compact assumed. In plain terms, the states divided up more water on paper than the river reliably produces, and they've been living off the difference ever since. For most of the 20th century, that gap didn't matter much in practice because Lake Mead itself was the shock absorber. Wet years filled it up, dry years drew it down, and the system balanced out. What nobody fully planned for was a stretch of dry years long enough, and hot enough, that the reservoir simply couldn't recover between them. It's worth pausing on how the tree ring science actually works because it's one of the more elegant pieces of detective work in American environmental history. Certain tree species in the Colorado River Basin, including bristlecone pines that can live for thousands of years, add a new growth ring every year, and the width of that ring tracks how much water was available during the growing season. A wide ring means a wet year. A narrow, tightly packed ring means a dry one. By coring long-lived trees across the basin, mostly through work centered at the University of Arizona's Tree Ring Laboratory in Tucson, researchers have been able to piece together a year-by-year record of Colorado River flow stretching back well over 1,000 years, long before anyone was measuring the river with instruments. That record is what makes it possible to say with real confidence that the specific stretch of years used to negotiate the 1922 Compact wasn't just a little generous. It was one of the wettest multi-decade stretches in the entire reconstructed history of the basin. Some engineers present at the Santa Fe negotiations reportedly raised concerns at the time that the sample period was too short to be reliable, but with 7 states eager to lock in guaranteed water, and a federal government eager to avoid an armed standoff over the river, those concerns didn't carry the day. The deal got signed, and the American Southwest got built on top of it. That's exactly what's been happening since roughly 2000. The Colorado River Basin has been gripped by what climate scientists now describe as one of the most severe multi-decade dry stretches in over 1,000 years of reconstructed record. For a long time, officials called it a drought, a word that implies a temporary departure from normal that eventually snaps back. But by the early 2020s, federal water managers had largely stopped using that word in favor of a blunter one, aridification. A drought ends. Aridification describes a permanent shift to a drier baseline, less snowpack in the Rockies, earlier snowmelt that runs off before soil can soak it up, hotter temperatures driving more evaporation off reservoir surfaces. If that's the right description of what's happening, then the wet years the 1922 Compact was built on weren't the normal condition interrupted by drought. They were the anomaly, and the drier conditions of the last quarter century are closer to what the basin has looked like for most of the last millennium. The numbers track that story closely. Lake Mead peaked at its all-time high in 1983, brimming near full pool. From 2000 onward it began a long, uneven decline. It dropped below 1,100 feet by 2010, kept sliding through the following decade, and in 2021 fell low enough to trigger the first ever official shortage declaration on the Colorado River, forcing mandatory cuts to Arizona and Nevada. A deeper shortage tier followed in 2022. As of mid-2026, the lake sits around 1,043 feet, about 186 feet below full pool, and holding roughly a quarter of its total capacity, a level that, a generation ago, would have been considered almost unthinkable for the reservoir that anchors the entire lower Colorado River system. The distinction between drought and aridification isn't just semantic hair-splitting among hydrologists. It changes how you plan. If a dry stretch is temporary, the correct response is to ride it out, tighten belts for a few seasons, wait for the snowpack to return, and let the reservoir refill the way it always has. If instead the region has shifted into a genuinely drier long-term climate state, riding it out stops being a strategy and starts being a form of denial. Warmer temperatures don't just mean less snow falls in the Rockies. They mean the snow that does fall melts earlier and faster, soaks less effectively into parched soil on its way downhill, and evaporates more aggressively off the surface of reservoirs like Mead and Powell once it arrives. That's part of why even years with near-normal snowpack in the upper basin haven't translated into the kind of reservoir recovery that similar snow years produced a few decades ago. The math connecting mountain snow to reservoir elevation has quietly changed underneath everyone's feet. Federal water managers haven't been shy about naming the shift in internal planning documents, even if the public messaging has been more careful. The Bureau of Reclamation's own operational studies, updated each year, now routinely model scenarios in which Lake Powell upstream and Lake Mead downstream both continue trending lower over the coming decade, and contingency planning between the two reservoirs, coordinating releases from Powell into Mead to keep both above critical thresholds, has become a near-permanent feature of how the system is run, rather than an emergency measure reserved for the worst years. Hoover Dam was engineered to do two jobs: generate electricity and release water downstream to the farms and cities that depend on it. Both jobs depend on the lake staying above certain elevations. The first threshold sits around 950 feet. Below that, the dam's turbines start losing efficiency as water pressure drops, and the risk of cavitation, destructive air bubbles forming in the machinery, starts climbing. Hoover Dam generates several billion kilowatt hours a year, enough to serve well over 1 million people across Nevada, Arizona, and California. So a serious decline in generating capacity would ripple through the regional power grid, not just the water system. The second threshold, and the one water managers genuinely dread, is 895 feet, officially known as dead pool. Below that elevation, water can no longer flow through Hoover Dam's lowest outlet works by gravity. The reservoir would still be receiving inflow from the Colorado River, but nothing would be able to leave it through the dam. No downstream releases. No power generation. The entire plumbing system that carries water to Las Vegas, the Central Arizona Project Canal, and the farms of the Imperial Valley would effectively be severed at the source. As of this summer, Lake Mead sits roughly 148 feet above dead pool, which sounds like a comfortable cushion, and compared to the darkest projections of a few years ago, when the lake briefly looked like it might approach that line within a matter of seasons, it is a meaningfully better position than it once was. Conservation deals struck among the lower basin states, along with a couple of wetter years in the upper basin, have bought real time. But the underlying math hasn't changed. The lake still loses roughly 600,000 acre-feet a year to evaporation alone, water that disappears into desert air without ever reaching a faucet or a field, and the system as a whole is still promising more water on paper than the river reliably delivers. A run of hot, low snowpack years could erase a decade of gains in a hurry, which is why federal planners continue to treat dead pool as a live possibility rather than a hypothetical. To put the volatility in perspective, in a genuinely bad year, one with a weak Rocky Mountain snowpack, a hot early spring, and heavy downstream demand, Lake Mead's elevation can fall by 15 to 20 feet or more in a matter of months. A cushion of 150 feet sounds enormous until you realize that a handful of consecutive bad years, of the kind the basin has already lived through once this century, could burn through most of it. That's the uncomfortable part of the math nobody likes to say out loud in press conferences. The current buffer is a function of recent conservation success and a bit of favorable weather, not a permanent structural fix. Move the weather back toward the pattern of the early 2020s, and the gap to power pool, let alone dead pool, starts closing fast again. It also helps to understand what actually happens as the lake crosses the zone between 950 feet and 895 feet, because it isn't a single cliff edge, it's a slow degradation. As elevation falls through that band, Hoover Dam's turbines have to be recalibrated and in some cases physically modified to keep functioning efficiently at lower water pressure, which is part of why the Bureau of Reclamation has already spent money retrofitting some of the dam's generating units for reduced head operation. Power output drops gradually rather than shutting off all at once. But the closer the lake gets to 895, the narrower the margin for error gets, and the less capacity the system has to absorb a genuinely bad year without triggering emergency operations rather than planned ones. Nobody watched these numbers more anxiously or moved faster than Las Vegas. The Southern Nevada Water Authority draws roughly 9 out of every 10 gallons the city uses from Lake Mead, and its engineers realized early in the 2000s that the existing intake pipes, built decades earlier when a full reservoir seemed like a permanent fact of life, sat at elevations that could end up above the waterline if the lake kept falling. In a worst-case scenario, Las Vegas wouldn't run out of water because the lake went dry. It would run out because the city's own infrastructure could no longer reach whatever water was left. So the authority built its way around the problem. Starting in 2008, crews began work on what locals call the third straw, a new intake tunnel bored far beneath the 2 existing ones, reaching down to roughly 860 feet, below even the dead pool elevation of the dam itself. It took about 7 years and roughly $1.5 billion to complete, with tunneling crews working in pressurized conditions deep under the lakebed. When it was finished in 2015, it gave Las Vegas the ability to keep pulling water from Lake Mead even in a scenario where Hoover Dam itself had stopped releasing anything downstream. It's a striking piece of infrastructure precisely because of what it signals. The agency responsible for the city's water supply was willing to spend well over $1 billion preparing for a collapse scenario that, officially, the system was never supposed to reach.